Hello, and welcome to the newest episode of the Red Pilled Fiction Factory. Up until now, the channel has focused exclusively on interviews with contemporary writers talking about their recently written red-pilled novels. But as the channel evolves, I'd also like to include reviews and discussions of older works of similar type of fiction, as well as more general discussions about the role and importance of having well-written, plausible, positive, reality-oriented stories in our lives, something that's all too lacking at the moment. With this in mind, whenever I interview a guest, I ask them to give me the main literary influences, guided them in the course of their own evolution as writers. And at this point, inevitably, half a dozen names come up, and they nearly always include Chandler, Robert Heinlein, Ayn Rand, and Ian Fleming. So today, I'm going to examine the life and work of one of those writers, namely Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond. To help me in that task, I'm honoured to be joined by Tom Burroughes, a lifelong James Bond aficionado and an Ian Fleming connoisseur. Like Fleming, Tom is a UK-based financial journalist who has worked for Reuters, where Fleming also worked for a short stint. But rumours that he has an office on Regent's Park or that he travels the world bedding exotic beauties and eliminating enemies of Her Majesty's government by the score are, he assures me, pure hearsay. So fresh from shaking his New Year's Eve martini, I'd like to introduce Tom. Hi, Tom. Can you hear me, Tom?
Hi there. Hi there.
Thanks for joining us on the show. Would you kindly introduce yourself, give us a bit of a background of where you come from, what you do, and what led you down the 007 path in the first place?
Okay, where do I come from? Well, in terms of actual physically, where do I come from? I'm from the east of England, and I'm a 54. I live in central London these days, and married, and it was a full-time job. As you describe, as a financial journalist, which has kept me incredibly busy over the last few years. Interesting enough, where I live in central London is only a few short walkways away from Ebury Street, which is where actually Fleming in the 1930s actually had a flat as a single man in a building that was a converted church, which I think he would regard as a tremendously amusing, given that he was not exactly a particularly religious individual. And actually where I live, right smack in the middle of Pimlico, there are lots of reminders, both from various sort of plaques and actual buildings, of just how much government and various agency organisations there are. You've got MI6 across the river from me in Vauxhall Cross, MI5 down the road. There are other sort of offices around where who knows what's going on in them, as well as embassies and the like. So you're always reminded of the fact there's a lot of government, both domestic and foreign, literally within my short reach. In terms of the books, I've enjoyed them as much as, if not more, than the films that were later made of them. Which may sound like a bit of a strange thing for some people, because obviously the first I encountered the Bond phenomenon was on the movies with, actually I think it was Roger Moore was the first actual actor I saw playing the character. But I've actually got into reading the books, and I really like what can be described as the romantic realism of the style that Fleming worked in. He's got very sharply defined characters, clever plots. There's a tremendous sense of pace. Descriptively, he's very rich. You can tell that Fleming was a good journalist, both in his time at Reuters and later at Kemsley News Group, and also at the Sunday Times. I like the fact that that for all his flaws, and let's be honest, he has quite a lot of them. He is a hero. He's a conscious and efficacious actor in dealing with difficult situations. He's an unashamedly patriotic without being noisy about it. There isn't a lot of, although there are some interesting points, there isn't a lot of angst or self-loathing that goes on in that you sometimes get in more supposedly realistic types of writing. I also like the fact that he likes to have a good time when he can. Death may come at any moment for James Bond. So he's determined to have a good time whilst he has the opportunity, whether it's there's a sense of driving his blower Bentley very fast, or enjoying a nice glass of something bubbly and so forth, or getting his skis to go down a slope nice and quickly. And I like that sort of joie de vivre, and also that sense of suavity and control which he brings to the character. That he's a person who's always in control, without not always in control, but he's in control of the overall pattern of what he's trying to do. And I really like that, and I also like the sardonic sense of humour which comes through the books. I like the fact that, I mean, to some extent, Ian Fleming wrote the books as a bit of a bit not as a joke, but he wrote them because he knew that they would be amusing to people, and he had quite a mischievous sense of humour. He liked ribbing people, including close mates like Noel Coward and some of the other literary types he came into contact with. And that comes out in the books sometimes more than people perhaps give it credit for.
Wow, yeah.
So I think that's why I'm a big fan of the overall package. And I think that also explains why I've become a bit wary of the direction of the very most recent films. So I think that's probably why we are at this point, Richard, having a conversation at the moment.
Yes, we'll come to all that. That's vital to the conversation, indeed. How did you, like most of us, I think, early teens, you're no longer want to read children's books. You're looking for adults, to break into the adult reading market, but there's an awful lot of stuff that's never going to appeal to you, either because it's too old-fashioned or the wrong topic. And Bond sort of fits a teenage boy's idea of what novels should be about, thrillers and so on. So, how did it? That's how it happened to me, certainly. How about you? Where did you? How did you discover it?
There were a few. There were a few sort of adult writers that I began to explore in my teens before I came to Fleming. I think I was actually quite late in my teens. I may have been 19 or even 20 when I picked up the first one, which, if I recall, was Live and Let Die. And I remember buying it in a bookstore where I was attracted by the racy cover art, where you had a picture of an extremely svelte lady draped over a large golden gun, and she had not much on apart from some kind of fur. And I thought maybe this book might be worth reading. It'd make a change from the more worthy stuff that I was being asked to do at English literature classes at school. And so that, I think I remember that was the first one. And I remember then pretty much saying, okay, what I'll then do, because I knew that my father actually had all the old pen paperbacks at home. And in fact, I've collected, I now have them. And some of them are actually quite old and pretty collectible. So I decided what I would do was then literally go right back to chronological order and read them all in sequence, starting with Casino Royale right to the very end.
Yes, I think once you've tasted the fruit, it's difficult to resist reading all of them. And of course, that's a good point. The cover art was central to the appeal, I think. Once you've seen an early Bond book in real life, the images stick with you forever. It was brilliantly done and brilliantly marketed, and it's hard to resist once you've seen one. So you started with sorry, which one was it? You Only Live Twice.
Yeah, I started with Live and Let Die, and then to then back up and, as it were, reverse and go back to the first one of Casino Royale, and then made sure that chronological order. Was this
parallel with watching the films? Because the films also appeal in the same sense as the books do to the young man.
Yes, they do. I mean, I must admit that when I started watching the films, it was quite a while before I read the books, so I must have been only about 9 or 10. Because you may remember this, and growing up in the UK, when we only had 2 or 3 main TV channels, over Christmas, this time of year, if you were very well behaved, your mum and dad would let you sit up and watch the Bond film.
Yeah.
It was an annual event. And of course, this was the 70s, so 77, 76, so it might have been a Roger Moore film by then. Probably. I forget which Roger Moore film it was. I think it might have been Live and Let Die, which of course is very different from the book. And I remember thinking, well, I've developed ever since a massive crush on Jane Seymour, but and also a desire to go to Caribbean. But I remember that so watching the films came before the books, and then over a fairly short period of time, um, before I read the books, seen most of the films, including all the Connery ones, the Lazenby one, and so I had a very particular idea in my head about what Bond was about. So when I started reading the books, what struck me was what it was in many ways is a bit of a shock because there
Yes, this is what I was going to come on to. Go on. Sorry, go on.
there are certain elements that the films don't or can't easily capture at all. There's just little elements of description of the ways that, for example, the way that the women are portrayed in the books is a bit different from how they are in the films. The women in the books often tend to have a flaw. They're often quite feisty, and they have a certain they have much more character and more three-dimensional. Whereas certainly in some of the films, I mean, I maybe don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but they tend to be just very, very beautiful women who drape on his arm and don't do a great deal, although that's changed. But in the books, I mean, there's a lot more going on in that sense. So that's one example. And also just the descriptions about what he has for a drink, or the kind of, the kind of ways he spends his spare time, such as it is. All those little elements that come in, which aren't in the film, struck me. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, that this is a much more involved character than you get from the books and from the films. And of course, the films created a certain kind of tongue-in-cheek humor, because certainly with maybe with From Russia with Love, and certainly with Goldfinger, under the influence of Richard Maybaum, one of the main writers on the films, who was a genius, a brilliant writer, but he felt that they needed to have a lot more humor because the books are actually pretty serious.
Yes, they are. Yeah.
There is a sardonic wit in them, but they are pretty serious. And I think there was also maybe coincided with the satire boom in the UK. The influence of people like Peter Cook and all of those guys, and it was mostly men. They felt that nothing could or should be ever taken seriously, and so even with Bond, he couldn't ever do anything without making some smart aleck remark. There always had to be tongue-in-cheek type humor, which in a way you can understand why they wanted to do it, because it was obviously, some of it is very funny, but you couldn't help but think that it was beginning to almost become a parody of itself at a certain point. But because when I started watching the films, I was just so impressed by this man who was so much in control. He was cracking a joke after having vanquished an opponent. And so it was quite a surprise when I read the books, thinking, this didn't happen. There was none of this in the books.
It's important, yes, to highlight that. The book, even the whole plot got thrown out when the film came to be made. Moonraker is set in England in the book, and he never leaves Kent, I don't think, throughout it. Yet in the film, of course, it's in outer space, completely different. Some of the characters change quite dramatically, and that's continued to this day, so that we don't even have a white James Bond anymore, or a male James Bond by the look of it, or a 007 at least.
Yeah.
He was, of course, writing at a time when Britain had just won a world war, and I say won in inverted commas almost. It had cost the country in terms of its treasure and blood. Its empire was being dissolved in front of everyone's eyes. Yeah. It was rationing. Yeah. It was a grey, grim place with bomb sites everywhere. Recently wounded or dead people in every street. And here he was offering these glamorous glimpses of the Caribbean or Hong Kong or wherever it might be. Jets had just come into being. So travel to these places was becoming something realistic, which it had never been before. And then there was the whole Cold War thing that gave covert sort of clandestine operations a glamour that they probably didn't enjoy too much before. Would you like to comment on how you see that, the timing of him coming into the world, and how that perhaps that evolves into the current state of how the world has changed so much that the way we look at Bond is also changing.
I think it's your introductory points are very, very on mark. I mean, the Fleming was in one sense extremely fortunate because his timing was that he was writing in the early 50s, as you say, when the memories of a terrible struggle and what it had done to the UK were everywhere around people. We still had rationing until 1953, the year of the coronation, which is a pretty sobering thought, really, when you consider how long government controls can continue long after they're supposedly to do, which is something you need to bear in mind today, by the way.
Yep.
And he knew that, although I don't think he thought about it almost like a marketing executive, in many ways, I think of what Fleming did, where the way he wrote about brands, he would describe the fact that Bond was sort of an early Rolex. He would describe the type of hair shampoo he used. He would talk about the compression ratio of the blower Bentley that he drove. Even he sort of said that they had Marshall headlights on them.
Right.
Sea Island cotton shirts.
Yes.
Suede and Aidney bag. He flew BOAC. He loved Tattinger champagne. Wherever you look, he was doing what people nowadays call product placement. But actually, he wasn't doing it in a crass way. He was doing it for verisimilitude, which is to say, we're going to put these real life details in to give this otherwise quite fantastical set of stories a sort of grounding in objective reality. And he did it by referring to the brands and the type of things that people were using and buying and spending money on. And at the same time, of course, spinning a certain, as you say, image of sophistication, cosmopolitanism, travel, fun. Many of his adventures are set in places where there's sun.
Yes, I noticed that, yeah.
Place. It still is in certain ways. But his adventures were in seaside resorts in France, or in Jamaica, or the Cayman Islands, or at the top of a Swiss mountain, or in Las Vegas, or in Southeast Asia, or he goes to Seychelles for one of his short stories. I think it's a Hildebrand variety. You rarely ever, apart from one or two stories when he's in Berlin, where I think it was one where he gets to, what was it? I forget. Somehow I remember. Brain freeze here. There are very few stories where it's set in places which are dark and grey and forbidding.
Yes.
They might be dark and grey and forbidding when he's writing about the Smersh headquarters or something like that. But what the actual main action is always in places which is always bright. And that, of course, and Fleming was always, what he was doing, even if he wasn't doing it always deliberately, was creating an image of something that was very bright and light and attractive, knowing that a lot of the people who will be reading these books will be taking the 7:15 into King's Cross on a grey February morning. And yes. I think that was a very both fortunate in the time when he was writing, because he's beginning to capture the beginnings of a consumer culture. The period through the 50s where you had Harold Macmillan ended up saying you never had it so good, but there was obviously a period of growing consumerism and enjoyment of life. People began to move out into suburbs. People began to find it easier to drive cars and own them. You had rock and roll. You had all of these things come bubbling through on both sides of the pond. West Germany, as it was beginning to move into one of the most prosperous countries. France is beginning to recover. All of these things beginning to come together. I think Fleming caught that wave very cleverly. Definitely. He wasn't just thinking, "Oh, how can I catch this wave?" He helped make it in a way.
Yes, it's worth pointing out. We haven't mentioned it, but he was a secret agent for all intents and purposes during the Second World War. He had seen action, in inverted commas, at that end of the spectrum. So he had first-hand knowledge of a lot of the maneuverings behind the scenes, and was in part responsible for where it led to.
That's right. I mean, it's actually said that I've heard it said that when he went into newspapers or in the news organisation business after the war, he was involved with Kemsley newspapers, which ended up being bought out. The people produced the Sunday Times. He ran something called a Mercury network, which is like a foreign correspondence network. And I have seen it said, I think it was by Jeremy Duns, or maybe some others, that Fleming, let's just say, he kept his hand in. So although he'd obviously with the Naval Intelligence Wing throughout the war, working with Admiral Godfrey and later others, is that even when he went into journalism, I think it would be naive to think that Fleming wasn't occasionally given a tap on the shoulder by his erstwhile colleagues to say, you might want to see about this. And obviously a journalist and someone like him and all his connections into society, he probably was a superb networker. He knew everybody, whether they all liked him as one thing another matter, but he knew everybody. Someone like that was bound to want to be kept within the orbit. So I'm pretty certain that the Secret Service is, they knew how to get hold of him over a drink now and again.
So sure.
He understands how it works. And I think his understanding of the mechanics of it were better than he credit for. He actually understood spycraft. I think he did understand how it all worked.
You said you were going to bookmark a few passages to give anyone listening who's not familiar with the work a chance to hear the quality of his writing, because a lot of the criticism, and there's been awful lot of criticism aimed at Fleming for the Bond character and the franchise, talks about it really being sort of low quality pap, not much better than pulp fiction, but it's way beyond that, and that's just the voices of the jealous and the insane, as far as I'm concerned. Have you got a couple of, or one passage, or?
I've actually got three, but one's quite short. I was going to start off by saying I agree totally with what you just said, but here's one example. The first example I'm going to give you is from Moonraker, the third of his novels, the one, as you said, that's set nearly all in Kent and a little bit in London. This is on page 63 of my Penguin edition. And this is when he's in Blades, a gentleman's club where gentlemen play cards. And one of the things that always struck me was that no one has written about gambling and about cards better than Fleming ever did. No one has come close.
True. No.
So here we go. M cut the cards and the game began. Bond lit a cigarette with hands that had suddenly become quite steady. His mind was clear. He knew exactly what he had to do and when, and he was glad that the moment of decision had come. He sat back in his chair, and for a moment he had the impression that there was a crowd behind him at each elbow, and that faces were peering over his shoulder, waiting to see his cards. He somehow felt that the ghosts were friendly, that they approved of the rough justice that was about to be done. He smiled as he caught himself sending this company of dead gamblers a message that they should see that all that went well. The background noise of the famous gaming room broke into his thoughts. He looked round. In the middle of a long room, under the central chandelier, there were several onlookers around the poker game. Raise you 100, and 100, and 100. Damn you, I'll look. And then there was a shout of triumph, followed by a hubbub of comment. In the distance he could hear the rattle of a croupier's rake against the counters of the chamois game. Near it at hand, at his end of the room, there were 3 other tables of bridge over which the smoke of cigars and cigarettes rose towards the barrelled ceiling. Nearly every night for more than 350 years there had been such a scene, he reflected, in this famous room. The same cries of victory and defeat, the same dedicated faces, the same smell of tobacco and drama. For Bond, who loved gambling, it was the most exciting spectacle in the world.
Lovely. Yeah, very
so
good.
That's from Moonraker, and that's when he takes on Drax and finds out that he's been cheating at bridge.
I think one of the greatest lines written by Fleming, and one of the greatest lines I think in literature almost, is earlier than in the same book, earlier on, when M is explaining who Drax is, and he says Drax cheats at cards in the briefing.
That's the ultimate crush. That's the ultimate. You know, you can be a complete shit, but if you cheat at cards, then it's game over.
Yes. And it's a line that just leapt out at me when I read it the first time. It's never left me. It was just so beautifully balanced.
Here's another passage for anybody who's ever woken up feeling a bit down in the dumps. Here's this. This one is for you. Page 77 from Russia with Love, and it's in part 2. This is the part after the initial plot is laid out. So here we go. The blubbery arms of the soft life had Bond round the neck, and they were slowly strangling him. He was a man of war, and when for a long period there was no war, his spirit went into a decline. In his particular line of business, peace had reigned for nearly a year, and peace was killing him. At 7:30 on the morning of Thursday, August the 12th, Bond awoke in his comfortable flat in the Plane Tree Square of the King's Road, and was disgusted to find that he was thoroughly bored with the prospect of the day ahead. Just as, in at least one religion, acidity is the first of the cardinal sins, so boredom, and particularly the incredible circumstance of waking up bored, was the only vice Bond utterly condemned.
Lovely passage.
Right. It's just perfect.
Yeah.
And there's one more, and then I will bring this to an end. So this is from Goldfinger.
Yeah.
Where Dupont has asked Bond to help him out into working out why it was that this strange man was consistently fleecing him at canasta. And this is, again, another example of gambling. But this is actually not about the actual way in which, as we all know, Goldfinger was cheating by getting an attractive blonde to look for a set of binoculars and radio down to him what was going on. But this was the impression that Goldfinger had on Bond the first time that R. James clapped eyes on him. And this is from page 428. And this is from my multi-edition, which has got a very good introduction by the late Christopher Hitchens, by the way, who was was a fan of Ian Fleming's writing, which is interesting because Hitchens is a man of the left. So it shows that they are people from across the spectrum who like how he wrote. Anyway, here we go. When Goldfinger had stood up, the first thing that struck Bond was that everything was out of proportion. Goldfinger was short, not more than 5 feet tall, and on top of the thick body and blunt peasant legs was set, almost directly into the shoulders, a huge and it seemed exactly round head. It was as if Goldfinger had been put together with bits of other people's bodies. Nothing seemed to belong. Perhaps, Bond thought, it was to conceal his ugliness that Goldfinger made such a fetish of sunburn. Without the red-brown camouflage, the pale body would be grotesque. The face, under the cliff of crew-cut carroty hair, was as startling without being as ugly as the body. It was moon-shaped without being moon-like. The forehead was fine and high, and thin sandy brows were level above the large light blue eyes, fringed with pale lashes. The nose was fleshily aquiline between the high cheekbones and cheeks that were more muscular than fat. The mouth was thin and dead straight, but beautifully drawn. The chin and jaws were firm and glinted with health. To sum up, thought Bond, it was a face of a thinker, perhaps a scientist, who was ruthless, sensual, stoical, and tough. So those are examples, I think, of one of the really defining qualities of Fleming. And Anthony Burgess called this descriptive lust. That is the ability to really, really describe with total accuracy and in a way that was both expressive but not over the top what a person looked like and what a person's outward appearance might tell you about what they were actually about. And it's actually worth a book I would recommend by Jeremy Black. It's called The Politics of James Bond, and he talks a lot about one of the trademark qualities of Fleming was using people's appearances as a big part of explaining why they might be considered good or bad actors. That could, of course, take him into sensitive, some would say, over territory. But it was nevertheless, it was something that he did really, really well. His villains are beautifully described. There's not I mean, maybe Scaramanga was one that didn't make much of a positive impression on me, but then Fleming was very ill when he wrote his final book. But most of the villains are beautifully described.
Yes, I quite agree. And those are excellent passages you've chosen. They really highlight the quality. And I would urge anyone who's not familiar with the works those aren't the only good passages. You could almost open a book at random and start quoting it because it's
Just pick one up.
Yeah, and they're all very easy to read. How aware do you think? What did Ian Fleming want from his? He was from a wealthy family. He might not have been super wealthy, but he certainly didn't need the money. Do you think he was a bit of the what he was writing about in your second passage? I think where he was just a bit bored and he wanted to avoid the ennui and acidity of life by sharpening things up a bit with a fictional character. Where do you think he was coming from? And do you think he knew what he was creating when he was creating it?
I think the answer to the second part of your question is, did he really fully understand what he was unleashing on the world? I don't know whether he did. And I think he developed a rather strange relationship with this fictional character that almost began to take him over to such an extent that I think that he was becoming a bit wary of him and wondering how he was going to be able to come up with a new plot. And I think it will be interesting to know that whether, had he lived lots longer, whether he might have done what one or two writers today do, which is effectively hand over the character to somebody else. Lee Child, the writer of the Jack Reacher books, has handed it over to his brother, I think.
Really?
Yeah, and he might have even said to people like Kingsley Amis, who did write a Bond succession novel, look, I'm taking a break. You go and write it.
And at this point, let me if I can just interject. For those that don't know, Fleming died relatively young, about 54, 56. Just that really as his fame was reaching beginning to take off because through the films mainly, and Kennedy had read one of his books and been photographed with it. So we lost him at not quite the peak of his abilities because, as you say, the last books weren't probably as good. But it was a career cut short in mid-stride, and it would have been very interesting. We'll have to guess how it would have developed otherwise.
But in terms of more broadly, what was he trying to do? I think that most writers, there's almost a semi-autobiographical issue going on there. He obviously drew heavily on his own experiences and those close to him. Obviously, not just his time in the naval intelligence world, but also his time as a journalist covering the Moscow show trials, which had a big impact on what he thought about Russia. And I think that that's something which doesn't always get enough understanding, that unlike, say, Le Carre, who I think almost becomes overwrought with trying to make out the equivalence between the two. And I think that some of the comments about Le Carre recently have been verged on the hagiographic. I think Fleming was under no illusions and wanted to make people clear that he had no illusions about that regime. So there's an autobiographical aspect to him. He's drawing on those kind of experiences, drawing on also his love of the outdoors. He was quite an outdoorsy sort of person, albeit one who liked solitary or individualistic activities, whether it be skiing, mountaineering, swimming, scuba diving. For example, he was one of the first people to get to know, as a journalist, Jacques Cousteau, who pioneered the subaqueous gear that we all now use. And he was he did a great deal through these novels to open up the excitement level of subaqueous. In many ways, that's not something he doesn't always get credit for. He's one of the first writers to really understand the undersea world and make it come alive and weave it into plots in a way that no one had done really before. And because he grew up reading people like Jules Verne as a boy, and it was obviously influenced by that. And so there's an autobiographical aspect to it. Yes, he came from money, so he didn't need it. But I think he actually quite liked the idea that he would hopefully make quite decent money writing. I think he was there's almost a sort of a Scottish Presbyterian strain in him. It wasn't all vodka martinis and smoking 80 cigarettes a day. He put a shift in when he wanted to. He worked really hard in certain ways when he wanted to. He worked incredibly hard during the war, and when he wanted to write books and research them, he was prepared to put in the hard yards. And I think that that's another quality which perhaps gets a bit overlooked. I think he did want to make quite serious money from his writing, and I think he would have been delighted had he seen the big bucks really roll in the way that, say, J.K. Rowling with Harry Potter has been able to do it.
Which, of course, they did. Of course, they did, but just after he died, unfortunately.
Had he lived longer, he would easily have overtaken J.K. Rowling. Yes. He would, you can imagine him. Had he made it into the 70s, he would have been probably the richest writer this country has ever produced by some distance. And even when he was alive, he liked to point out that he was helping the British balance of payments by the amount of books he was selling.
Is that right?
So I think the money, whilst it wasn't a primary driver necessarily, I think he really enjoyed the fact that he was able to make money, and that I think maybe also because he was only third or fourth generations of family where the Flemings in the mid 19th century had been pretty poor. They were just a bunch of fairly humble Scottish crofters, and who Robert Fleming, his grandfather, made money in importing jute from India, and then set up a merchant banking business. But they were relatively recent. They were like nouveau riche. They were an example of Victorians, middle class from Scotland, who had really hit the big time by working very hard. So Fleming probably was a bit. He wasn't entirely of the establishment either. He was never. He wasn't going to be just Stafarian lolling around on his parents' money. I think he had a sense that he did want to put a dent in the universe.
And certainly he did. Right, that brings us more to the present day then. Obviously, he started writing almost 70 years ago. It seems incredible now. Certainly in the early 50s, he I think, he first published. So the world has changed a lot. Moors, the way people see things and behave, have changed a lot. Of course, he's fallen victim to many of the trends and fascinations of today, leading to dramatic changes. The books can't be changed, thank goodness. But in the film, obviously, we're seeing a complete revolution take place at Eon, which is the group that controls the franchise. They're now basically, it looks like they're going to take him out of the franchise altogether for goodness knows what reason, and replace him. Thoughts on how he would have perceived this modern age? Would he have approved of any of this? Would he be will he be spinning in his grave? Thoughts on it overall?
Well, I think that there are a number of things to be said about this. So first of all, is that trying to speculate entirely on what he would have made of certain things is always going to be fraught. Yeah. Needs to carry a certain number of health warnings. Because on certain issues of his time, he was relatively liberal, particularly in views about sex and in views about things like gambling. He couldn't understand why gambling was banned in the UK. I have a rare book by a former CIA operative who wrote a book about how to play poker. And Ian Fleming wrote a foreword to the book. I bought it for a few dollars off eBay. It's worth a lot more than that, so I'm rather proud of myself. But Fleming writes with tremendous vigor about what he saw as the prudishness and the priggishness of the British establishment's attitude towards things like gambling. So in some ways, he was quite libertarian. I don't think he would have approved of the nanny state interference with aspects of our lives, whether it be what we eat or what we drink and so forth. I mean, in his own personal life, he clearly was not somebody who was overly concerned with that. And even when his doctors told him to cut down on the cigarettes and all the rest of it, his attitude was, if I can't live life how I want to, then what's the point? I think he would have had a problem with a number of issues today. One is he would have had a problem with the complete risk aversion in our culture. The precautionary principle. I mean, we see how this is played out with the COVID crisis today. We could talk a bit more about that later, perhaps, but he certainly would have had a problem with the avoidance of all risk. He wouldn't have liked the way that people are overprotective towards children and not allowing them to play outdoors. He would have worried about that. He would have worried about that creating a fragile generation of people. I think he would have worried about things like that. I mean, he didn't have a particularly nice time at his public school. And in some ways that affected him, not always in a good way. So he wouldn't have swung to the opposite extreme either, of saying that that there doesn't need to be some recognition that the things were badly done in the past. But I think he would have been a bit worried about the risk-averse nature of our culture. In terms of the political correctness issue and about trying to melt down differences between men and women and all of that sort of stuff, I think he would have been pretty appalled, actually. Judged based on his own comments in some of his novels, he made it quite clear that the world's a better place when men and women are seen a bit as different, not equal but different. And
let's not forget, he made fantastic female characters that were very strong and vibrant characters in their own right. It's not like they were all. The films are more guilty of.
Yeah, I mean,
stereotypical women than in the books.
when he described honey coming out of the sea in Doctor No, or talked about other women, they were often athletic. They were very capable. They were sexy and beautiful, but they were also tough as nails when they needed to be. This is very different from the kind of fiction that was around at the time. Um, so on the sort of the sexual agenda that we see today, I think he would have had a real problem with people denying male and female differences. In fact, he probably would have seen it as quite sinister, actually. Now, I think he would have gotten into trouble today still, as some of the comments he passed about gay people and people of, he wouldn't have had, he made some quite sharp remarks in his books. Although here's the funny thing, the editor of his books, William Plummer, was gay, and one of his best mates was Noel Coward. And they had a very relationship, and they used to write teasing letters to each other about each other's works, and they got on like a house on fire. They were great mates. So I don't know. I think with Fleming, I think he would have been shocked and quite worried about some of the trends we're seeing today. He would argue that this isn't good for the long-term interests of anyone, and would have been concerned about it. The thing is that you have to bear in mind, of course, that when you look at his own personal life, he wasn't a particularly good father. Didn't spend a lot of time with his son Caspar. He obviously had, let's just say, he had a very interesting personal life. There weren't many women that he hadn't made a pass at by the time he met and married Anne, Rothermere as she was, and then their relationship was quite stormy. Although they actually, right to the end, they were very affectionate to each other. They realised they probably weren't right for each other.
Right.
But I think he would have been. I think he would have been worried about some of this stuff for sure. I think he would not have recognised it. He would have found some of it very difficult to explain what's going on.
He's not alone.
And I think also what's also interesting about him, though, is that on issues like race and cultural appropriation questions, that people of all races got a part in his books. Now, it's easy to say that some of his ways, his descriptions and characterizations could look a bit off today, and I think even someone who's not as un-PC as I am would probably say that there's some passages out of Live and Let Die, they do great quite a bit. But the fact of the matter is that he's generally a general attitude that comes through the books is not one I regard as being out of place at the time. You can't always judge by the mores of today. I think he probably also would have recognised that things were going to have to change. There were glimpses of it in his books, certainly.
Yes.
There were glimpses of change.
Yes, I sympathise with everything you've said there.
When his book, The Spy Who Loved Me, he wrote it from the perspective of a woman.
Yes.
Bond only shows up in the last third of the book. That's quite a brave thing for a male writer to do. And for someone who's supposed to be a reactionary, that's a very surprising thing for someone like them to do. So, he was a complicated character.
Yes, I agree entirely. I don't think he was black and white on too many issues. He would have gone with the flow to a degree, but he would have certainly drawn the line. At the point we've reached today seems to have gone far beyond anything that's reasonable in terms of adapting and adopting new mores. The Bond books and plots, I can't resist. They lend themselves to the world we're in right now.
Oh, do they ever?
2020. The closest analogy to 2020, if you wanted to sum it up in, apart from some dystopian novels, it does seem tremendously Fleming-esque. We've got the latest thing being this Klaus Schwab from his mountain retreat in the middle of Switzerland, dictating a plan for a new world order. The only thing seems to be, he's got the hair, the lack of hair, the outfit. The only thing missing is his white cat on his lap. How do you think he would view all this today? Was this what he was thinking about perhaps when he was writing the books? Was there more to them than we thought?
Well, the funny thing is that you're not the first person, and I'm not the first person to have drawn a connection between Klaus Schwab and Ernst Stavro Blofeld. When I was working for the American Newswire in the mid-90s, I went to the World Economic Forum 3 times in Davos. I've met him. He's actually quite an avuncular chap. I've actually
That's
met
hilarious.
And they have a big party on a Saturday night at the end of the conference, and everyone dresses up in black tie, and it's like a giant James Bond party because it's held. Everyone's in black tie. You know, there's lots of these attractive Russian dolly birds running around. And I actually joked to my news editor on the phone. I said, I could be in on Her Majesty's Secret Service right now. All we need is a revolving restaurant and we're done. And so the parallels are really quite funny. But I think, being serious, what would this is an extraordinary time. The kind of sort of entity that Schwab's WEF is an example of a kind of global think tank networking organization which started off fairly humble origins. There's nothing remotely sinister about how it started off. It was just like a business club. It's like a Rotary, if you will.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there are thousands of these organizations around the world. And of course, Fleming was members of many gentlemen's clubs, which are often basically networking of their time. Long before we had LinkedIn or Facebook, people used to go to join clubs. The World Economic Forum is hit on the idea that you would just get lots of CEOs and opinion formers together under sort of Chatham House type rules, and you would persuade them all to go to some swanky ski resort in Switzerland for a week. But what's happened with that institution is that over time, as it's morphed into this body which all of the great and the good feel they have to be seen at. Although in the last few years there's been some pushback. I think President Trump declined to go one year because he just didn't want to go. I think Fleming would have regarded it as highly interesting that people of this type are holding forth about resetting, rebuilding, changing the world. And he wouldn't necessarily have seen them as sinister. He would have seen some that were just as slightly comical and hubristic, actually. Yep. I think he would have, some of the language that people are using, I think it would have made him smile. Some of it
knowingly, yes.
Yes. I've heard this before. Because, you know, I suppose he would have harked back to some of the flowery terms for Woodrow Wilson when the League of Nations was formed in the 1920s, or one or two other sort of grand projects that often take root, and would have seen how some of this stuff can get out of hand. I don't think he would have seen Schwab as sinister so much as a bit out of his talking through the wrong part of his body. But I think he would have been quite amused or bemused by some of the parallels. I mean, do you know, of course, on the Majesty's Secret Service, the document that M reads from when they were talking about biological warfare is called
Corona. Yeah.
I mean, when I thought that, I actually a shiver went down the back of my neck. I thought Fleming had it all dialed in about 50 years ago. It's amazing.
It is amazing. And another reason to read the books.
Another reason
Well, I think we'll draw it to a close there. You have mentioned to me before that you're thinking of writing your own book. Would you like to comment on that? Will we be able to interview you again shortly on that?
Well, one of these days I'd like to write. I mean, I was thinking about writing a novel based around my own experience as a financial journalist, because I think there's the world of money and financial markets is often one that tends to be seen either as deathly dull or not really holding a lot of opportunity for cut and thrust. But we know that 10 years ago, of course, more than 10 years ago, we had the financial crisis. We've had plenty of things since. So I've been thinking about maybe writing a novel where I touch on that as a topic and draw. I mean, I think that the one lesson we learn from people like Fleming is you need to write about what you know. Bring some of yourself to the story. Don't be embarrassed about that. So that's one option I've got in my mind. Another, I was thinking maybe, although I'd have to be very careful, would be writing one from my experiences in being in Malta. But I certainly think the first idea is one I'd like to have a go at, and we'll see how we get on. Because I think that there's no point, I mean, appreciating great friction if you're not necessarily going to have a go at least trying to do something yourself. I mean, we owe it to ourselves to keep doing these things, and if we want to make sure that some of the nonsense that's been going on recently is kept at bay, one of the best things we can do is to keep creating ourselves, and make sure that the pipeline is kept busy.
That's a very strong theme in this channel. I usually mention it at least once, and that's why the channel exists. Really, it's to keep in the public eye these issues and show that there's still life in us, and that it's not over yet. Because if we can't do that, if we can't fulfill the basics of creating our own culture and continuing it, then there's no point in really doing anything else at all. Anyway, it's been a great pleasure, Tom. Thank you very much. I'll leave you in freezing England, and hope you have a great 2021.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard.
All the best. Bye.
Thank you.